Welcome to this lecture, everybody. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about, um, teaching verbal behavior and the assignment for the end of this module. At this point, you've spent a few weeks both discussing and learning about verbal behavior and the verbal operants. And there's a couple of things to really pay attention to here. One, the analysis of verbal behavior has lent to conceptualizations in a number of areas. And one of those areas is how to teach verbal behavior to individuals who have limited verbal repertoires. This has probably been the area where the analysis of verbal behavior has been the most prevalent, and there have been really effective procedures in order to teach such skills. So we're going to delve into that a little bit today and then talk specifically about the assignment. Before we get into verbal behavior specifically, I want everybody to think about the purpose or the goal of teaching. When we say that you are going to teach a skill, what are you really talking about? If that wasn't long enough to take the time to think, please feel free to pause and think a little bit more. Teaching is one of those words that we talk about a lot. However, when we're really talking about the technicality of teaching, sometimes there are some things that are mixed. Think about if you had described the goal of teaching to bring new behavior into the repertoire of a learner. That could pretty accurately describe teaching, but really, what does that mean? Sometimes we may be teaching brand new skills that have never been emitted, or behaviors, responses that have never been emitted by a learner. However, we also, and maybe more frequently, may be bringing skills that have been emitted under new stimulus control. So thinking about that purpose, really what we're trying to accomplish through teaching, might be to bring behavior under the control of desired environmental variables. Thinking about it, do we really care whether a response occurs, or if a response occurs under specific environmental control and not at other times? To paraphrase a bit, we're looking for responding to occur at certain times and not at others. This is really important, but may not be completely clear. So let's look at a couple examples. So think about this situation. What is the behavior that is being displayed in this picture? Now, thinking just about the movement of the muscles in the picture, well, that is being displayed by the picture because the picture is not moving, but the movement of the muscles is the kicking, right? So the flexion of the leg in a certain way. Now, kicking is one of those behaviors that we definitely would like to occur in the presence of a soccer ball, but not in the presence of someone's shins. This is an example of when teaching would be very clearly bringing the behavior under the control of certain stimuli and not others. Another one that I use frequently, and I apologize if I have said this to you in the past, but it's pretty embedded within my repertoire, it's my strong operant, is that how often do you care that someone can say the word for? They say for at all times. It really is not what you're looking for. However, you are looking for the word for to come under the stimulus control of what's 2 plus 2, or 2 plus 2 equals. So this is why stimulus control is so important to consider when teaching any skill, because we rarely care that the skill just occurs, but we care about when it occurs, under what conditions the skill itself occurs. As we've also learned about conditional discrimination in this class and more complex stimulus control, thinking about that first example, think about different contextual control that would have additional control over kicking a soccer ball. So in the presence of a soccer ball in your living room, the desired response may not be kicking. However, there also may be situations where you're looking for straight conditional discriminations that standing in front of a goal and the coach saying go may result in kicking in the presence of a soccer ball. Similarly, if a teacher is saying what's 2 plus 2 in a classroom of many students, the desired response may be 4 from all students, or it may be raising a hand, right? So there are different conditions and different contexts where certain responses will contact reinforcement. And that's the whole goal, is that we teach skills under the control of certain environmental variables that will result in reinforcement in most situations. Now, just to review a bit, let's bring this assessment of controlling variables to the analysis of verbal behavior. As you've talked about or read about or engaged in Foxy Learning modules about, each operand is different not because of the topography of the response, but because of the controlling variables. So therefore, when we're thinking about teaching, we need to be thinking about the controlling variables, not necessarily just the topography of the response. A attacked and echoic textual behavior, manding, and interverbal could all have the exact same or may have the exact same topography of responding. However, the controlling variables are different. So verbal behavior is one of the clearest examples of how teaching and learning are really bringing responding under the control of certain variables. So just to review, let's match the controlling variables to the operand, or the operand to the controlling variables. So I think tact is first, but take the time now to yourself just match the controlling variable to the operand. Okay, if you've completed the exercise, we're going to continue. If not, press pause and take a little bit more time. One thing to note is that some of the controlling variables would make sense for more than one of the operands. However, each of them has a quote-unquote best answer, so that each of the 5 operands will be matched to a different controlling variable. So let's start with the straightforward one, the tact. Which of the controlling variables did you match to the tact? I hope everybody said the nonverbal stimulus, because nonverbal stimulus is there's a mistake. Nonverbal stimuli evoke tacting behavior. Now let's think about the echoic. There are 2 options here, but one of them is better. So if everybody's looking for the best option for controlling variables, I hope you said vocal verbal stimulus, because the mode or the form of echoic behavior and echoic stimuli are vocal. Similarly, the textual behavior will have a specific form of behavior. So I hope for the textual, you said the written or text-based verbal stimulus. I tried not to put the word text in there. And how about the mand? I hope you said the MO plus audience would control manding behavior, or manding behavior would fall under the control of the MO plus the audience. And intraverbal would be the one with the least specific controlling variable, as it's a verbal stimulus. Of course, you know that then the intraverbal will not have point-to-point correspondence with that verbal stimulus. So when you're teaching each of these, if not as important, potentially more important than the form of the behavior, is going to be the controlling variables. So taking that into consideration, you think about just discrimination training. Of course, I'm showing here a simple discrimination, but we know that conditional control may also occur. So thinking back to our 5 verbal operands that we talked about on the earlier slide, what you're looking to do is teach that behavior in the presence of the SD and any other variables that should be present. And you're also going to consider reinforcement, because remember, reinforcement is how stimulus control is acquired. Behavior is more likely to occur in the presence of certain antecedent stimuli because of a history of reinforcement under such conditions. It's also important that there will be no reinforcement in S delta conditions. So thinking about that is really important as well, because like we said, the whole purpose is to bring behavior under the control of certain controlling variables, which means that not only does the behavior have to consistently occur at those times, but it needs to not occur at other times. Using the example is walking around the house saying 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. Since the goal of behavior, or of teaching, is to bring behavior under the control of certain antecedent variables, it's important when we write goals and objectives that that is what will be demonstrated, and that goals and objectives cannot be said to be mastered unless that is demonstrated. So there are 4 parts that need to be included when you're writing a goal in order to assure that this is the case. The first part is obvious, who, meaning the learner. I used the word obvious, but it's an important part. If the goal is for the learner to engage in behavior of some sort, then it needs to be very clear that it is the learner who is actually engaging in the behavior. I've said a number of times the behavior, so that's where the next component of a goal comes in. So a learner will do what? What will be demonstrated by the learner? This is really important that it's very clear exactly what will be demonstrated. It's also important that it is very precise, meaning that we're talking about actual behavior. If you use ambiguous terms like match, that may be a good word if you're looking for multiple topographies of responding to be included in the goal, meaning point to, touching, putting one thing on top of another, picking up 2 things and putting them together. But you see, I just described 4 topographies of behavior that could be involved in matching. If you're looking for specific behavior, it needs to be very clear. Simple words are better. Say, touch, bend, rather than giving words that may sound a little more formal or a little more complex, however, are not as precise. So one kind of hint that I give to everyone is just say what you want to see or hear or what have you. So far we say we have who will do what. When is the next word, and more specifically, this is under what conditions. So who will do what under what conditions? So meaning, this is where the stimulus control part comes out in. Not only will they say something, but they're going to say it when someone else asks a question, or when something is present. You need to describe the antecedent stimuli that you want to come to control that behavior. And then the last point will be to what extent, right? How much do they need to demonstrate the skill in order for it to meet the goal? This can be a number of different things. It can be a number of times that someone needs to do something in a row. It can be a number of times it needs to be done within a certain percentage of trials. It can be a number of novel responses, but it really needs to be clear what needs to be or to what extent this behavior needs to be demonstrated in order to have met the goal. Sometimes goals are written so that a skill is said to be mastered, or sometimes it's written so you can move to the next step of learning that skill. All of these are fine, but it needs to be very precise as to what is to occur. So let's look at a few goals and tact or identify, depending on how you're going to do it, each of the components. So the first one is, when given a model, the student will imitate the action for 5 consecutive novel actions. So let's see. Take a minute to point out the who, what, when, and to what extent. All right. So the who here would be the student. The what will be imitate. The when would be when given a model. And the to what extent would be for 5 consecutive novel actions. Thinking about that here, this may be precise or not precise enough depending on a situation. The word imitate, if it is precisely imitation, meaning that the imitation perfectly meets the model, might be sufficient. However, if approximations of the modeled action will be accepted, then it's not sufficient. So it's important just to think about what this would do in terms of both procedural integrity and inter-observer agreement. So let's look at another one. Okay, so this one says the student will correctly complete 10 single-digit addition problems on a worksheet in 30 seconds or less for 5 novel worksheets. So take your time to point out the who, what, when, and to what extent. Okay, if you need more time, pause it here. But here, the who would again be the student. Correct completion of 10 single-digit addition problems. This could again be precise or not precise enough or not. We're not exactly sure of the response mode or the form of the response here, but it could be implied that it is written. But again, implication is not the best, most precise way. So thinking about it, under what conditions, you have the worksheet, and 30 seconds or less for 5 novel worksheets. to what extent is clear here. These may be different measures of criterion than you may be used to. Some other criterion measures may be in 8 out of 10 trials, for 90% of opportunities, things like that. But the to what extent can be measured in a number of different ways. So then the next step of teaching or designing a teaching plan would be to determine all of the different things that are needed for the goal to be reached. The first of these is going to be the teaching method. Are you going to use prompting and prompt fading, shaping, chaining, a number of different things that you may have learned about in different classes or in previous classes? Thinking about what is required for each. So, for instance, if you have a behavior that already occurs under different stimulus control, prompting and prompt fading may be a good option to transfer stimulus control from the prompt to the desired SD. If not, you may shape the response from an already existing response. Chaining would be a good idea for a behavior that requires multiple discrete responses to be chained together to form a behavior chain. So it's thinking about, because you have your goal written very clearly and the what on that goal is very clear, which teaching method is best for your specific situation and your goal. Based on that, then, and the goal, you will have to pull apart what is going to happen before the behavior, right? You need to make sure at all times that the desired SD or the controlling variables that are part of the goal are going to be part of what happens before the behavior occurs. Then any additional variables based on your teaching method will also need to be considered. For instance, prompts, if being used, always come before behavior. So that's going to need to be included. And then if there are any other conditions that maybe need to be considered, for instance, context, if things happen inside versus outside, or in a specific class or something like that, it all needs to be considered so that it can be put together with the rest of the teaching protocol. Another thing that needs to be considered then is when you're teaching the behavior, what will happen after the behavior. If the behavior occurs to the extent that you're looking for it to occur, what will reinforcement look like? This is not only what the reinforcer will be, but what the magnitude of the reinforcer will be, what the schedule of reinforcement will be, potentially duration, right? All of your parameters of reinforcement need to be included when discussing the reinforcement piece of your teaching protocol. Additionally, if the behavior does not occur in the manner that it is expected, whether it doesn't occur at all, or a different behavior occurs, or if the behavior does not occur without a prompt, or whatever the described behavior is or correct response is, what will error correction look like? Remembering that error correction can be a number of different things. Will you represent the demand and make them do it again, maybe with an additional prompt? Will you deliver an aversive stimulus like no? Will you take something away? There are a number of different options for error correction, and they need to be described just as reinforcement will be described. One thing just to note is that I did just say that error correction could involve representing the demand and a prompt. Note that that is not a prompt for the errored response. It is a prompt for the behavior for the next opportunity to respond. Prompting does not happen after a behavior, it happens before a behavior. Thus, you must be talking about the next response. This is just a common mistake, so I just wanted to be very clear with that. And lastly, you want to Lastly, you want to consider moving, which is an interesting word to describe. But what this group of considerations is really how you will change levels or steps or any piece of the plan itself. So considering what needs to happen in order to advance or master a certain skill. What, this is the to what extent piece of the goal. However, if you are going to move through different levels of a teaching procedure, advancement through each needs to be described. Likewise, what needs to happen in order for remediation to occur? What needs to happen in order to either move back a step or for there to be a consideration of a change in program or to add additional steps? That needs to be really clear. And then, as most skills that we teach are not meant to happen in the or let's say solely within the context that we teach them, how will this goal be generalized? And then importantly, what are the expectations, or how are we planning for maintenance to occur? And remembering that when we teach skills in a real discrete setting in a really specific way, generalization and maintenance typically do not occur. So we need to utilize either methods for promoting generalization or training to actually generalize the responding and maintain it. Typically when we teach behavior, the consideration that we have up higher of reinforcement is pretty dense. So, any thinning of that schedule or potentially thinning too fast could result in ratio strain and the behavior could be placed on extinction. So maintenance is really important to consider. Once we have developed our methods for how the behavior will actually going to be taught, we need to know how we're going to determine whether this is effective or not. Like any other behavior analytic procedure, we will collect data and analyze those data consistently to assure that what we're doing is working. So when we're talking about data collection, some of the things you need to consider are what is the best measure for that response, meaning what will, which measure of data collection, which measure of behavior will be most representative of that responding. Sometimes it's frequency, duration, latency, IRT. I'm going through many measures. Sometimes it may be percent occurrence. Sometimes some type of time sampling procedure will be most representative, but we need to determine this specific measure. Then also we need to determine we need to develop data collection systems for both reliability and validity, assuring that that the data are being collected reliably and that procedures are being run with integrity. And a step that is sometimes missed is the data analysis step. How are we going to graph these data? At what rate are we going to graph these data and analyze the effectiveness of the programming? And what will the visual analysis include? Who will do it? And how will these analyses be communicated? All of this it's just as important as the procedures themselves, because we really don't know if our teaching procedures are effective without these steps. So it's something to consider. So now let's talk about assignment 2. The purpose of this assignment is to, 1, demonstrate your understanding of verbal behavior and its controlling variables, which is what this module is based on, but also to be able to extrapolate that information into a teaching protocol so that you can start to engage in behavior that behavior analysts frequently engage in, meaning that if we have a problem that there is not that a skill is not being demonstrated in any context, the way we would approach it is first assess it. Oh, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. Okay, that's what happens when you talk with your hands. So when we have a problem that a skill is not being demonstrated under a certain context, we will first assess it, then develop a plan, and look at the effectiveness of that plan through data analysis. This is your opportunity to demonstrate those skills in the context of what we are talking about with verbal operants. So you will have the opportunity to complete 3 already designed program guides or curriculum guides or program sheets, people call them many different things, for 3 different operants, and then develop your own individual program guide for a 4th operant. This is a way to shape up those skills. Your 4th program sheet should not look exactly like one of the 3 sheets. We did our best to give you 3 completely different designs of program sheets, but there are only certain there. Also, you should not replicate a data sheet from another place that you are working or have worked in the past. This is your chance to really hone those skills of developing these guides. So I'm going to talk about just a couple considerations and things to really think about as you're going through this assignment. So tip 1, it's more of something you should really do than a tip, but you need to review all of the material that has been provided in the Blackboard platform. All of this includes the instructions for the assignment, the rubric. This is really important. You will see exactly where points will be added or deducted. If you are unsure of something that is on the rubric, you should contact your instructor about that prior to the day before it's due. Your Foxy Learning Introduction to Verbal Behavior tutorial is going to be really, really important. Because it's going to really discuss those controlling variables and where the behavior occurs in relation to those variables. Another thing I'm going to do is to make a lecture from Advanced Learning 1, which a lot of you took, available as well, just for this information, but this is where you're going to get that context. Also, to review the articles in the resources folder, which are all about teaching verbal behavior. So that would be very important to review as well. Similarly to that last provided resource would be to review other articles within the literature base. Right now there are a lot of articles focused on teaching verbal behavior to individuals with limited repertoires. Remember that one of the things that we are expected to do as behavior analysts is to utilize evidence-based programming. The way we do this is through literature review. So if you find an article and systematically replicate that article in order to fit your context, you are doing this. You should not use the same exact words that the article uses, and should not submit something directly from the article. However, taking exactly what they did, and if it's written very technologically, you should be able to do this easily, and transferring those parameters and that structure to your curriculum guide is very good practice. You want to make sure then to somewhere give credit to the study that you are replicating, which is good practice to become involved in. The third tip is to work from the goal or the objective backwards. So we talked about goal writing and the purpose, but if you have your goal you should make sure that all of your teaching is headed towards achieving that goal. So anything you're doing on your program guide should be able to either be in the attempt to make the what happen, make the behavior happen, or to bring it under the control of the when, of the stimulus conditions, or to assure that the to what extent that the criterion is being met. Anything on that guide should be headed towards that goal. If there are things missing from your curriculum guide in your goal, then you might need to change your goal. But if you have the goal, you should be able to assure that you have thoroughly addressed the behavior and the controlling variables, and the to what extent, remembering that your reinforcement and error correction procedures will all be an attempt to bring it under the control of the when, right? Because stimulus control is acquired because of a history of reinforcement. Which is exactly what I said here. I apologize for not changing slides. But again, just to reiterate that your goal will cover the who, what, when, and to what extent, which all should have procedures or definitions or information addressed in the curriculum guide. This is honestly, with the exception of the who, for many of the behaviors or many of the areas of interest. Thinking about it, as long as everything is moving towards the learner engaging in the who, when, and to what extent, this would be the case. So, moving on to tip 4, consider what the behavior. Considering when and if the behavior is currently occurring, and if so, under what conditions. So thinking about this, we know that we want a tact to come under the control of a nonverbal stimulus, and the MO and audience to control a man, and the interverbal, echoic, textual all to come under the control of different types of verbal stimuli. However, it's important to determine when it is currently occurring so you can utilize those stimuli potentially as prompts. So, for instance, if you have a situation where when you sign book, the student signs book because of a history of some kind of generalized conditioned reinforcement, you may be able to use that in order to transfer stimulus control from your sign of book to a picture of a book. So in this situation, when you show the picture of the book, you may sign book at the same time, because in the past that has been a scenario where the student will also sign book. And then you can gradually fade your sign of book, and the picture itself will come to evoke signing book in the past. Again, with that tact, will assure or make sure to continue to utilize some form of generalized conditioned reinforcement. Just looking at this now, I realized that is not clear, that is clapping. So that's what it is. It's not an additional sign. Similarly, when you have the picture of the book evoking signing book, you may use that to transfer control to the MO, book deprivation of some sort, and the librarian, which could be an audience. So in the presence of a librarian, if you hold up a picture of a book, it may evoke the signed book, and then you can, the librarian could deliver a book. Gradually fading out that picture of the book may result in the MO and the librarian evoking the man for book. But it's important to know how and when that behavior already occurs. So if you saying something results in them engaging in the echoic behavior or similar, then you might utilize that as a prompt and fade it out. But it's important to be considering all of these things prior to developing a teaching protocol. Lastly, my last tip is to consider both the teacher behavior and the student behavior. So when we think about our goal, all of that should be the behavior of the student. However, most of the behavior on the teaching protocol is going to be the behavior of the teacher. The assumption here is that the behavior of the teacher will be controlled by the words on the teaching protocol, and the behavior of the student will be affected by the behavior of the teacher. So, when we think about this, all of those words that you write on the teaching protocol should be in an attempt to change the behavior of the teacher. Some of the things that we know about behavior of humans is that more words may result in less likelihood to read, so keeping it simple would be important. Writing it as clearly as possible is also important. Then also describing the behavior of the teacher and the behavior of the student is going to be important, because what the teacher does is going to be dependent on how the student responds. So an error correction will only be implemented if the student responds incorrectly. If a student engages in certain types of responding, the error correction may change. Reinforcement will only occur if the student responds correctly and with all parameters considered. So it's important that you really designate both the teacher behavior and the student behavior. I hope this helps with not only the assignment, but just a systematic approach to thinking about teaching and learning. If we forget stimulus control, we're really forgetting a huge component about teaching. So verbal behavior is a great place to practice that. You have all of the information for the assignment in the assignments folder in addition to this lecture. So feel free to get started and make sure to reach out with any questions. Obviously, there wasn't a lecture check-in for this lecture. It was more to supplement what you are doing and to help out. So have a great day, and I hope you are enjoying learning and talking about verbal behavior.